subject matter that I'm going to be talking about, and I titled it, Who's Afraid of a Little Horn? And I want to revisit the subject of the little horn that we saw come up out of the beast. But before I do that, I want to just refresh your memory about some of the things that we've looked at in the book of Daniel. We know that in the book of Daniel, Daniel had a vision, and Daniel saw four different beasts. He saw the lion, the leopard, the bear, and he saw this beast that was different from all of the rest of the beast. This beast was diverse from all of the other beasts. A number of things happened with this beast. This beast ended up having 10 horns come up upon his head, and then there was another little horn that came up among those horns, and Daniel began to consider that horn. And in Daniel chapter 7, verse 19, he says that he wanted to know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others. He was exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, they break in pieces. They stamped the residue with his feet, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth, that spoke very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. Verse 24, he begins to get the interpretation, and it was said that the fourth beast would be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which would be diverse from all kingdoms, and would devour the whole earth, and would tread in pieces and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he will subdue 3 kings. And he would speak great things against the Most High, and he would wear out the saints of the Most High, and he would think to change times and laws, and they would be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. And that's kind of where we left off. We did an entire scope. We did an entire broadcast in dealing with times, and the dividing of times. And hopefully, when you did receive the PowerPoint and you went back and you looked at it, it began to make a little bit more sense to you. We did discover that times, and the dividing of times comes out to 3.5 years, which in prophetic time equals 42 months or 1,260 days, and then noting that a day in prophetic time equals a year, so we had 1,260 years, okay? So, we looked at all of that information, and if you didn't get a copy of that PowerPoint, I would encourage you to send me an email so that you can understand the way that we're approaching it. And I thought that I was finished dealing with the little horn. But I want to go back, and I want to bring out some other things about this little horn. Because I also mentioned that by going through this portion of the book of Daniel, it would enable us to begin to weave in and out of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, because those books really go together and interpret one another. And so I want to go in, blessings you. So I want to go in and I want to look at some other things about this little horn. I want to open up, so to speak, our understanding about this little horn. And here's the reason why. Here's the reason why. It's easy for us in the 21st century when we think about Christianity. It can be easy for us to forget that there was 2,000 years of church history that preceded church history as we know it. Are you with me? There's 2,000 years of church history that precedes the day in which we live. It can be easy for us to think or to imagine that Christianity began in America. Or it could be easy for us to believe that Christianity began in the Middle Ages, or Christianity began in Western Europe, or Christianity began at some point. And we can forget that there's 2,000 years of church history that we have to deal with. 2,000 years of church history. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. In addition to the 2,000 years of church history, we have about 2,500 years of time that the Father dealt with the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. He dealt with them through the prophets. He dealt with them through the patriarchs. So when we are looking at the totality of the work of God in the earth, we're looking at close to 6,000 years of time. And it's easy for us to forget or to imagine that there were other generations of believers that were prior to us. And so when we look at the history, or when we look at, let me put it this way, when we look at what we believe God is doing today, we can be looking at it from a very narrow view. We can be looking at it from the standpoint, oh, God is doing signs, wonders, and miracles, which I believe he is. Or we can look at it from the standpoint that, well, God is restoring apostles and prophets, and I believe he is. Or we can look at it from the standpoint of God is pouring out blessing upon his people, and I believe he is. But there's much more to the story than that. There's a much larger picture that has to do with what God is actually doing with his church. I hope you hear me tonight. There's a much larger view than we can sometimes imagine. So I want to go back and I want to look at this little horn that we read about in the book of Daniel. Once we understand this little horn that we're reading about in Daniel chapter 7, we're going to be able to begin to weave in and out of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, neither of which are books of terror, neither of which are books that should frighten us, neither of which are books of cataclysmic events. The sad thing is that many Christians today do not feel it's necessary to understand anything about the prophetic books of the scriptures. Again, because they only believe the version of Christianity that we have received in the 21st century or in the 20th century in America. Yet we step back and we look at the condition of the church, and we want to wonder why the church is in the condition that it is in. This goes all the way back into the book of Daniel. So we're going to look at some things, and I want to share with you a number of things that have to do with this little horn, a number of things that were prophesied about the little horn, actually 11 things that were prophesied about this little horn. And then I want to begin to take those 11 things and I want to, piece by piece, I want to cover some things about those aspects. I'm not going to do it all tonight. It would take too much time. All right. So here's the thing that we want to know. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8, we read this. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns that were plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So the first thing that we discover is that this little horn that we're talking about arises out of the 4th beast that Daniel had the vision of. The 4th beast that Daniel had the vision of, we know, is the Roman Empire. So we discover about this little horn that this little horn must be a Roman power. Now, I want you to stay with me. The second thing that we discover about this little horn is that this little horn arises among the 10 horns. And we've already looked at the 10 horns being representative of the divisions of the Western Europe. All right. So when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was divided into 10 tribes. And we looked at all of that. So if you're unfamiliar, again, if you missed any of this, you might want to go back and get the PowerPoints. So the 10 horns are the divisions of Western Europe. So the little horn must arise in Western Europe. Now, there's a lot of conversation today about this little horn, or about the man of sin, or about the Antichrist, and where is he coming from? Is he going to be a Muslim? Is he coming out of Islam? Is he coming out of the East? Where is he coming from? Well, biblical prophecy informs us that this little horn, and you will see as we trace him exactly what it becomes, comes out of Western Europe. Here's the third thing that I want you to know about this little horn. The little horn rises after the 10 horns. Daniel 7 and verse 24. The 10 horns, out of this kingdom, they are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he will subdue 3 kings. So we know this little horn must arise after the 10 horns. So that being the case, we know that the Roman Empire must have fallen by this time. We're talking about pagan Rome. Now, some people may be wondering, and I'm just thinking here, some people may be wondering, what in the world does any of this have to do with Christianity in the 21st century? What does any of this have to do with my salvation with Jesus? What does any of this have to do with the awesome move of God that God is doing in the church? What does any of this have to do with my life on a day-to-day basis? What does any of this have to do with my walk with Christ in the 21st century? And I'm submitting to you, it has everything to do with your walk with the Lord in the 21st century. I submit it has everything to do with what happens in our churches in the 21st century. Here's the thing. And I'm going to say this, and I don't mean to say it harsh or come across arrogant or as a know-it-all, but by and large, the church in America is ignorant of church history. Let me say that again. By and large, the church in America is ignorant of church history outside of the particular denomination that they may belong to. And many of us don't really know the history of the denominations or the non-denominations that we belong to. So we really don't know what we believe or why we believe what we believe. All right? Example. We are a Protestant nation. America is a Protestant nation, right? Or so we say. Most believers in America, we would say we are Protestants. If you're a Lutheran, a Baptist, a Methodist, an Episcopalian, a charismatic, a Pentecostal, you name it, you are considered to be a Protestant. But if you were to ask most of us, what does that even mean? We have no idea. We have no idea why we would be considered Protestant. So by and large, the church is ignorant of its history. I guess that's a good way to put it, right? We don't know our history. The tragedy about a people who does not know its history is if you don't know your history, someone will make one up and give it to you. Let me say this as an African American, all right? Let me say this as an African American. If I am unaware of the history of my people, another group of people will give me a history. And I would be led to believe, right? I would be led to believe that my ancestors were actually running around the jungles naked, throwing spears with bones in their nose. Because that's the history that other people have given us. So if I didn't do my due diligence, my due research, my due prayer, my due study, I would not know that I'm actually descendants from kings and queens. So I wouldn't know this, right? So a people who are ignorant of their history, they will be given a history. Yes, someone is saying, God said, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. And this is exactly what's happening in the body of Christ today. Many of God's people, they're not perishing because they don't understand somebody's blessing plan. They're not perishing because of a lack of faith. They're perishing because of a lack of knowledge. They have a lack of faith because they have a lack of knowledge. Does this make sense? All right, stay with me. So this beast, this horn that's part of this fourth beast, right, must arise in Western Europe, and he must arise after the 10 horns, according to Daniel 7:25. Now, most historians let us know that the 10 horns, or the Western Europe, was established right around the year of 476 AD. Now, somebody's saying, look, I'm not coming to history class. If you're in this particular broadcast, yes, you are. I'm going to teach you some of the history of your faith. I'm going to give you some of the history of your faith. Good evening, dude. Right? Because we need to know what we believe and why. Right? This only makes sense. Scripture says that we ought to always be willing and able to give an answer for the hope that is within us. So we need to understand something about our faith. So most historians say that the 10 horns, or Western Europe, didn't come into existence until 476 AD. This is like stuff that we learned in like Western history. Good evening. Who was that? Alice? Lillian? Okay. I can't read the name, but somebody just said good evening. Good evening back to you, right? So this must mean that this little horn could not come to power until sometime after 476 AD, because it wasn't until 476 AD that Western civilization as we know it actually came into being. That is the division of the Roman Empire, pagan Rome. That's when Western Europe was actually established, 476 AD. So now we have a marker. We have a marker in time, 476 AD. All right, number 4. We know that this little horn was to pluck up 3 of the first 10 horns from the roots, right? So we know that 3 of the nations would be uprooted from history. We learned that when we looked at the 3 nations that were uprooted and no longer existed, the Herulu, I think the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, right? So we looked at all of that in an earlier session, so I won't take a lot of time in dealing with that. Now, Daniel chapter 7, verse 20 and 21. When I get to the end of this, and it's not going to be real long, you're going to understand why I stepped through this, because we are going to identify this little horn tonight, and then we're going to move forward from there. And, but moving forward from here tonight, I'm telling you, we're weaving in and out of Daniel and Revelation. And so you're going to see some things that's going to make a lot of sense to a lot of people, and it's going to cause some of you all to really have to pray through some stuff. All right, I'm just saying. So Daniel chapter 7, and he writes, of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth, that spoke very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, I beheld, and the same horn, watch, the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because now it begins to explain to us that this horn that we're talking about, whoever this little horn is, that this little horn is antagonistic to the saints of God. This little horn is a persecuting power. This little horn means no good to the saints of God. So when I ask the question, who's afraid of the little horn, it may have asked some people, it may have piqued in the minds of some people, who's afraid of the little horn? What little horn are you talking about? It's that little horn that is the persecuting power and has always been against the saints of God. So if you really want to know who the enemy is, we have to first of all identify who the little horn is, because all of the activity that comes out against the church has its root in this little horn. Oh, I hope this makes sense. This little horn. Now, let's look at number 5. It says that this little horn would speak great words against the Most High. Not only would the little horn attack the saints, but this little horn would speak great words against the Most High. Daniel 7:21. All right? And Daniel 7:25. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and would wear out the saints of the Most High, and would think to change times and laws, and they would be given into his hand until a time, and the dividing of times. That's what we looked at the other night. And so what we find out is that whoever this little horn is that is making war against the saints, stay with me, whoever this little horn is that's making war against the saints, he would prevail against the saints for a time and times and half a time, for 3.5 years, for 42 months, or for 1,260 years. Are you with me? We're talking church history. Stay with me. This is what I'm saying. We have 2,000 years of church history behind us, much of which many of us have no idea what took place in church history. All right? So stay with me. Now, I'm going to flip over for a minute, and I want to read a verse out of the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. If you're not writing the verses down, send me an email. I'll get you the PowerPoint. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. I'll read this. It says this, and there was given unto him, all right? There was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. Now it's interesting because Revelation 12:5 says there was given unto him to continue 42 months. Now, if you remember the chart that we did, let me see, do I still have that chart? Let me see if I can find that chart for y'all. If you remember the chart, I believe this is it. Yeah, if you remember the chart, here we go. The chart says this. Daniel 7:25, it's mentioned as a time, a times, and half a time. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, a time, times, and half a time. Or Revelation 12:14, a time and times and half a time. Revelation 13 and 5, 42 months. Revelation 11 and 2, 42 months. Revelation 11 and 3, 1,260 days. In prophetic time, years. Revelation 12 and 6, 1,260 days. In prophetic time, years. They're all the same time frames. Times, and a dividing of time, 42 months, 1,260 days. In prophetic time, years are all the same time frames. So here we have in the book of Revelation something sounding very similar to what we read in the book of Daniel chapter 7 verse 25. In it, he will speak great words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High, think to change times and laws given into his hand unto a time and the dividing of time. Revelation 12 says that he speaks blasphemy against God. Let me read that again. And I want to look at this word blasphemy. I want to look at this. Revelation 13 and 5, there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Now, when we talk about blasphemies, what exactly are we talking about when it talks about blasphemy? So let's